For centuries, believers have quoted Paul's words, "You were grafted in." But what does that really mean? Most think it's about joining the church, becoming part of a new religion, or stepping into someone else's story. But what if that's not what Paul meant at all? What if grafted in was never about conversion, but transformation? In Romans chapter 11, Paul describes a mystery: wild branches joined to a living tree, drawing life from the same ancient root that began with Abraham. And here's the question almost no one asks. If the promises were given to Israel, then where did the nations truly fit? Are they outsiders looking in, or part of something far older than they ever realized? My name is the Prophet 33, and I bring you the Word of God. The reason I wear a mask is because I am persecuted in my country for my faith. This mask protects my life. Let's continue. Everyone's heard the phrase, grafted in, but most have never stopped to ask what it really means. For generations, believers assumed it was simply a poetic way of saying, joined the church. But when Paul wrote those words in Romans chapter 11, he wasn't describing membership in a new religion. He was revealing a mystery that reaches back to the very root of Israel's story. Romans chapter 11, verses 17 to 18 says, "If some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches." Paul's words aren't about replacement, but restoration, a reconnection to something ancient, sacred, and alive. So before assuming what it means to be grafted in, we have to ask, grafted into what? And why? If Paul wasn't describing a new religion, then what was he describing? The phrase grafted in appears simple, but hidden inside it is a question that challenges centuries of assumptions. Was Paul saying that the Gentiles were adopted into a different faith, or that they were being reconnected to the same covenant God began with Abraham? Romans chapter 11 doesn't speak of two trees, one Jewish and one Christian, but of one living tree with room for every branch that draws life from the same root. The real question isn't who started the church, but what the church was supposed to be. A continuation of the promises made to Israel, now opened to the nations. The mystery isn't about joining something new. It's about rediscovering something eternal. For nearly 2,000 years, most readers have approached Paul's words through a single lens, the assumption that God replaced Israel with a new people called the church. This idea, known as replacement theology, quietly shaped how countless generations understood salvation, identity, and belonging. But Paul never spoke of a new tree growing beside the old one. He warned the Gentiles not to boast against the natural branches because they themselves were supported by the same root. Romans chapter 11 verse 18 reminds us, "You do not support the root, but the root supports you." The hidden assumption has always been that God moved on from Israel, yet Paul says the opposite. The story never shifted from one people to another. It expanded, inviting the nations to share in a covenant that was never theirs to own, but always theirs to join. When Paul used the image of an olive tree, he wasn't inventing a new symbol. He was drawing from the Hebrew scriptures that every believer of his time knew by heart. In Jeremiah chapter 11 verse 16, Israel is called a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit. And in Hosea chapter 14 verse 6 it says, "His beauty shall be like the olive tree." Paul chose that same image to describe the faith into which the Gentiles were grafted, showing that the root of their salvation was never Greco-Roman philosophy or later church tradition, but the covenant God made with Israel. The olive tree Paul saw was alive long before the nations heard the gospel. It carried the sap of the patriarchs, the prophets, and the promises. And into that living root, the Gentiles were invited. The metaphor was never about starting something new, but about joining something ancient. In the Hebrew mind, a tree was never just a plant. It was a symbol of life, continuity, and covenant. When Jeremiah called Israel a green olive tree, he was describing a people chosen to bear fruit that revealed God's character to the world. The olive tree represented something enduring. It survives drought, it regrows when cut, and its oil brings light. So when Paul spoke of the Gentiles being grafted in, every Jewish listener would have recognized the meaning. This was about being joined to the life of Israel's covenant, to the same root that nourished Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It wasn't about cultural identity or ethnicity, but about spiritual inheritance. To be grafted in was to share in the life of the same promises, the same God, and the same purpose, to carry his light to the nations. Paul's warning to the Gentiles was simple yet profound: do not boast against the branches. The branches that were broken off represented those within Israel who stopped believing, but the root, the covenant itself, remained holy and alive. In Romans chapter 11, verse 16, he writes, "If the root is holy, so are the branches." The life of the tree doesn't come from the branches, it flows upward from the root. That root is the faith of Abraham. Trust, obedience, and relationship with the living God. To be grafted in means to draw from that same root, not to replace it. Every branch, whether natural or wild, depends on the same source of life. Without the root, no branch can live. And Paul's message still stands. Salvation is not a new tree planted in Rome or in any church. It's the same ancient olive tree that began with God's covenant to Israel, still alive, still growing, and still inviting new branches to share its life. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has already become a channel member through YouTube memberships. Your support truly helps me continue creating this content and building a spiritually meaningful community. If you feel connected and would like to support the vision, you can join by clicking the link in the description. It's simple, secure, and handled directly by YouTube. Thank you for being part of this journey. The word Paul used, enkentrizo, carried a meaning far richer than simply attached. In ancient Greek agriculture, grafting wasn't just about connecting one branch to another tree. It was about transformation. When a wild branch was grafted into a cultivated olive tree, the life of the root would actually change the nature of that branch. Over time, the wild branch stopped producing bitter fruit and began to bear the same sweet fruit as the tree it joined. Paul chose this image intentionally. He was saying that when the Gentiles were grafted in, they weren't just invited to stand beside Israel. They were invited to be changed by the same divine life that flows through her covenant. The graft didn't alter the root transformed the graft. Being grafted in was never about joining a group or identifying with a label. It was about a change of nature. Paul's metaphor describes something organic, not organizational. When a branch is attached to a living root, it doesn't simply belong. It begins to live differently. The sap that flows through the tree reshapes the branch from within. That's why Paul warned the Gentiles not to see themselves as spectators of Israel's story, but as participants in it. Romans chapter 11 verse 24 says, "You were cut out of what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree." It's not natural for two different trees to share one life, and that's exactly the miracle Paul wanted to highlight. This isn't about blending cultures or joining religions. It's about the supernatural act of God transforming those once far away into vessels that now carry the same life, the same purpose, and the same spirit that began in Israel's root. Paul's vision of the olive tree was never a theological metaphor for paperwork in heaven. It was a living image of spiritual rebirth. The Gentiles weren't simply given access to Israel's promises. They were drawn into the very life of God that those promises carried. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 13 explains it clearly. "But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah." That nearness isn't symbolic. It's transformative. To be grafted in means that the spirit that once empowered Abraham's faith now flows through those who believe. It's not a story of adoption from the outside, but of regeneration from within. The wild branches don't just stand beside the cultivated tree. They begin to breathe with it, to grow with it, to bear its fruit. That is the mystery Paul called contrary to nature, a miracle of transformation that turns separation into belonging. Long before Paul spoke of grafting, God had already declared his plan to Abraham, that through his seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. The covenant with Israel was never meant to be exclusive. It was always designed to expand outward. Abraham wasn't chosen to create a privileged nation, but to become a channel of blessing for every nation. That's why Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3 verse 29, "If you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise." The same root that nourished Abraham's faith is the source of life for every believer who trusts in the same God. When the Gentiles were grafted in, they weren't receiving something new. They were stepping into the oldest promise ever made, that the God of Israel would bring his light to the ends of the earth. The idea of the nations joining Israel's covenant wasn't new to Paul. It was woven throughout the Hebrew prophets. Isaiah chapter 49 verse 6 records God's words to the Messiah. "I will also make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." Zechariah foresaw a day when 10 men from every nation will take hold of the garment of a Jew, saying, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. These weren't metaphors. They were glimpses of a global redemption rooted in Israel. Paul's message in Romans chapter 11 wasn't an innovation. It was the fulfillment of what the prophets long ago envisioned, that the nations would not replace Israel, but join her in worshiping the one true God. The same divine plan that began in Jerusalem was always meant to stretch to the ends of the earth, until every tongue could say, "The Lord, the God of Israel, is God." The bridge between Israel and the nations was never human diplomacy. It was the Messiah himself. Through him, the ancient promises found their doorway into every heart that believed. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16 says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace." The Messiah didn't erase the identity of Israel or the nations. He reconciled them in himself. The same covenant that began with Abraham now flows through the blood of the Lamb, extending mercy far beyond the borders of one people. This is the true mystery Paul proclaimed. Not that the Gentiles discovered a new faith, but that through the Messiah, they entered the living covenant of Israel's God. The wall wasn't torn down to destroy difference, but to unite purpose, so that the nations could carry Israel's light into every corner of the world. Over time, the message Paul gave to unite the nations, and Israel was quietly reshaped into something else. As the faith spread through the Roman world, many began to interpret the grafting in not as joining a living tree, but as planting a new one entirely. The olive tree that once represented Israel was redefined as the church, and the story shifted from restoration to replacement. This misunderstanding gave rise to the idea that God had rejected his first people, that the old covenant had been discarded, and that a new, superior identity had taken its place. But Paul warned against exactly that mindset. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you do, remember, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Romans chapter 11, verse 18. The tragedy is that the symbol of unity became a banner of separation. The nations were never meant to replace Israel's story. They were invited to become proof that her story was true. When the idea of replacement took root, it didn't just distort theology. It reshaped history. Over the centuries, the misunderstanding of Paul's olive tree gave birth to hostility toward the very people who carried the promises. The faith that began within Israel's covenant slowly turned against its own source. From the Council of Nicaea to the Crusades, from forced conversions to anti-Semitic persecution, the error of replacement left deep wounds that still echo today. Paul's warning was prophetic. Do not be wise in your own opinion, Romans chapter 11, verse 25. The moment the nations forgot the holiness of the root, they began to boast in their own branches. The result was a faith detached from its origins, a faith that claimed to represent the God of Israel while rejecting the people through whom he was revealed. Yet even through centuries of distortion, the root never died. The promises of God to Israel remained alive, and in every generation he preserved a remnant who remembered where the story began. Today, as more believers rediscover the Hebrew context of their faith, Paul's words are echoing again. If their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Romans chapter 11, verse 15. The return to truth isn't about glorifying Israel or condemning the nations. It's about restoring the order God intended from the beginning. The Gentiles were never meant to stand apart or above, but beside, drawing from the same root and reflecting the same light. To return to truth is to return to humility, to recognize that faith in the Messiah was never a new story, but the continuation of one sacred promise still unfolding. Paul's revelation was bigger than reconciliation. It was creation. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, he wrote, "For he himself is our peace, to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace." That phrase, one new man, wasn't a metaphor for uniformity. It was the unveiling of something entirely new in human history. Through the Messiah, the dividing walls of hostility between Jew and Gentile were shattered, not so one side could absorb the other, but so both could become part of one living body. Paul wasn't building a religion. He was describing the restoration of humanity to its intended state, reconciled to God and to each other. The mystery of the one new man isn't about sameness, but oneness. Many branches, one tree, many nations, one kingdom, many stories, one redemption. The beauty of Paul's vision is that it preserves diversity while revealing unity. The nations didn't have to become Israel to belong, and Israel didn't lose her calling when the nations were invited in. Each branch remains distinct, yet everyone draws life from the same root. This is why Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13, "For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit." The Spirit doesn't erase identity, it redeems it. The faith that flows from the olive tree was never about uniformity but harmony, many parts forming one living whole. True unity isn't everyone looking the same, it's everyone living from the same source. And when that source is the God of Israel, every culture, every language, and every nation finds its rightful place in His design. The kingdom of God has never been about erasing boundaries, but about redeeming them. In the ancient world, empires united people through domination, Rome through power, Babylon through fear, but the kingdom unites through love and truth. It is not built by conquest, but by covenant. That's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 to 32, that the kingdom is like a mustard seed. It starts small, but grows until the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. The kingdom's strength is not sameness, but shelter, a place where many can belong under one divine purpose. The olive tree and the mustard tree tell the same story. One life, many branches. The nations were never invited to abandon who they are, but to bring their unique sound into God's harmony. In the kingdom, identity isn't lost, it's fulfilled. To be grafted into the olive tree doesn't mean joining an institution. It means sharing life with the God who planted it. Paul's message in Romans chapter 11 was never about adopting a label or switching spiritual citizenship. It was about entering a living covenant. Belonging, in the biblical sense, isn't ownership, it's participation. It's drawing from the same sap that once flowed through Abraham's faith, through Moses' obedience, through David's worship. John chapter 15 verse 5 captures this perfectly. "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing." Belonging to the covenant means abiding, letting that same divine life shape every thought, word, and action. It's not about claiming the root. It's about letting the root claim you. Paul didn't call the nations to admire Israel's story from a distance. He called them to live in it. To be grafted in is to share a connection that's alive, not symbolic, a relationship that breathes. Just as a branch depends on the flow of sap from its root, those who are joined to the covenant depend entirely on the Spirit of God to sustain them. In Romans chapter 8, verse 11, Paul wrote, "If the Spirit of Him who raised Yeshua from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Messiah from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through His Spirit who dwells in you." That life isn't theoretical, it's present, active, and transforming. The Gentiles weren't called to build monuments to Israel's faith, but to become living extensions of it, branches carrying the same life into the world. A tree doesn't live by remembering its root, but by staying connected to it. Paul's final warning in Romans chapter 11 is as relevant now as it was then. "Do not be arrogant, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He may not spare you either." Romans chapter 11, verses 20 to 21. The nations were never meant to stand above Israel, but to stand beside her in awe of the same mercy that grafted them in. The olive tree doesn't thrive on pride, it thrives on gratitude. Every branch, whether natural or wild, exists by grace alone. Humility isn't weakness, it's alignment with reality, the recognition that life flows from the root, not from us. The moment a branch begins to boast, it cuts itself off from the very source that sustains it. To be grafted in is to live with reverence, to remember daily that belonging is a gift, not an achievement, and that the strength of the tree is found in the humility of its branches. The truest proof of being grafted in isn't theology, it's fruit. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 verse 17, "Every good tree bears good fruit." When Paul spoke of the Gentiles sharing in the fatness of the olive tree, he was talking about the visible evidence of that inner life. The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Galatians chapter 5 verses 22 to 23. These aren't moral decorations, they're signs of divine life flowing through human hearts. A branch doesn't prove it belongs by claiming the root. It proves it by bearing the same fruit. That's how the world recognizes the true people of God, not by titles, traditions, or heritage, but by the unmistakable aroma of the same Spirit that once moved through the prophets, the apostles, and the Messiah himself. The mystery Paul revealed in Romans chapter 11 wasn't about conversion. It was about transformation into a new kind of belonging. The Gentiles weren't merely accepted. They were reborn into a story older than nations themselves. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 19 says, "You are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household." This isn't metaphorical, it's a redefinition of identity. Those who were once distant are now family. Those who were outsiders are now part of God's dwelling place. True belonging in the kingdom isn't earned by lineage or erased by culture. It's received by grace and proven by fruit. It's the realization to be grafted in is not to imitate Israel, but to share her heartbeat, to love what God loves, to walk in His ways, and to carry His presence into the world. The miracle of the olive tree was never about inclusion for its own sake. It was about transformation through connection. The Gentiles were never called to become Israel, nor was Israel ever meant to stand alone. The story has always been one tree, one root, one life, flowing through many branches. Romans chapter 11, verse 36 brings it all to a close. "For from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. To Him be the glory forever." The mystery Paul revealed wasn't about who is greater or who came first, but about the wonder of a God who invites all humanity to share in His covenant life. The branches that once grew wild now bear fruit from the same ancient root, and the light that once shone in Jerusalem now reaches the ends of the earth. The Gentiles were never meant to replace Israel's story. They were meant to reveal Israel's God. And the root still calls out to every branch. Stay connected, stay humble, and let the life of the kingdom flow through you. The story of the olive tree isn't just about history, it's about destiny. Every branch, every nation, every heart is invited to return to the same source of life that began in the heart of God. The root has never stopped reaching upward, and the Spirit still whispers the same call: come back to the covenant, come back to the root, come back to the life that never dies. Isaiah chapter 2 verse 3 says, "Many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us His ways, and we will walk in His paths.'" This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a greater one, where Israel's light shines again and the nations walk in it. The tree is still alive, the promise is still open, and the invitation still stands. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching and being part of this journey with me. Now I invite you to check out this recommended video right here. And if you're hungry for more eye-opening content, hit the subscribe button and let's keep learning together.